Hi folks, we're going to start talking about Chapter 4, which is newspapers. This is the first of a three-part series of videos covering what's in the textbook and also some other information I want to pass along the way. The bulk of this part focuses on the history of early newspapers, and there's quite a bit of detailed information, and I apologize for that, but it's important to see some of this information to talk about it so you get a greater understanding of how it affected newspapers later on down the line. The first newspaper we know of was called the Acta Diurna, or translating that, was called Daily Doings, a Roman newspaper that was published about 59 BCE. You may be used to the term BC, before Christ. BCE is before the Christian era, which is a little more precise accounting for the time and the era that this paper came out. It contained mainly information about births and deaths. There was apparently quite a bit of daily gossip in it, but we're just guessing a little bit because we know of it because it was referred to in other publications, but no actual copies of this first newspaper exist. So that's how we know what we know about it. A series of Venetian newspapers came out. They were called Avisi, translation gazettes, starting about 1566. These were handwritten papers. They were handwritten by scribes who were paid to sit and write the same thing over and over again. Most of them focused on politics and military conflicts, and basically a lot of them were battle accounts and things like that, where the news had to be dispatched to a number of people reasonably quickly. But as you can imagine, being handwritten, it still took quite a while to produce. There's a big leap forward in 1440 when Johannes Gutenberg was credited with inventing movable metal type. Now, some people you might read, you may have heard that Gutenberg was responsible for creating the first printing press, and that's simply not true. There were many printing presses before his time, but sometimes they used carved wood. Even ancient Sumerians and Chinese especially used clay tablets in which images and words were printed on, and they were used in primitive presses to produce sheets of images and words. But Gutenberg's thing was that he invented a process where metal type could be cast, and then when you were done printing a page, you could clean off the ink from the metal type, which is simply the letters in reverse, and reuse it, which was tremendously economically beneficial. You wouldn't have to only last as long as a clay tablet plate would last, or a wooden tablet would last, which they don't last very long actually. So as a matter, so that changed it to where he could print 4,000 pages per day, which is about 1,000 times faster than a handwritten scribe could write a page. And obviously it's very uniform and neat and easy to read, and you didn't have imperfections or sloppy spelling or things like that. Now, I don't know if this is in the book, but there's speculation that the person who actually came up with the idea for movable metal type was not Johann Gutenberg, but his wife. So that's an interesting tidbit to note going into the second test, that you may get a extra credit question or something on that, but some people think it was his wife. The first weekly papers came out about 1609. They were printed in German. There's a title of a couple of them there. The first newspaper from England came out about 1621 and has a very long title, of course, with some spelling that was common at the time, all up into even the 19th century. So the main things to take away from this was the first newspaper, the Gutenberg movable metal type factoid, and when the weekly papers first started coming out. So in terms of the English weekly papers, there was a paper called The Heads of Several Proceedings in this Present Parliament. In other words, it was talking about government decisions it was probably primarily information about war and freedom of the press, those sorts of issues discussed. Uh, and I may mispronounce it. I usually pronounce it right, but Areopagitica was a newspaper published by John Milton, the author of Paradise Lost and a lot of other important books that are kind of long and boring and hard to read, in 1644. And there's an image of the actual printing of it. This was kind of a controversial newspaper. It discussed the bans on certain books. It talked about a little bit the role of newspaper freedom. And it actually advanced the idea that journalists should be more than mere observers. They should take an active role in commerce. And commerce at the time was not just economic commerce, but the daily doings of the public and the government. The newspaper also advocated for more advertising, and that would create more space for what we call editorial content. Editorial content doesn't have to be editorials in the sense that we're using it. It can be anything that's news or is not advertising. It fills the content role. It's worth noting this name that I won't try to pronounce in German because German is not one of my languages. The world's oldest surviving daily newspaper, underlined daily, came out from Germany in 1650. More importantly, this other early daily newspaper in 1702, the London Daily Courant, in which case now we're starting to get into the realm where newspapers are adding headlines and illustrations. If you look carefully, you can probably see some short headlines or subheadlines, both on the German paper and also headlines in between the paragraphs on the Quran. So some of these are very important early newspapers. Where you might come into play here is knowing, if I gave you a list of 4 or 5 of these papers, newspapers, which one is not a real paper, that kind of thing. Colonial American papers are of most interest to us because of several ones that led up to helping establish freedom of the press in this country. One of the more famous ones was from a publisher named Benjamin Harris, called Public Occurrences, both foreign and domestic, and I'm using his spellings. And the first article they published was about Native Americans in Plymouth, Massachusetts, hosting the first Thanksgiving. And at the top right of your screen, you'll see there's actually the lead of a starting point of that story. The civilized Christians in some parts of Plymouth have newly appointed a day of thanksgiving to God for his mercy in supplying their extreme and pinching necessities and their late want of corn, and for his giving them now a prospect of a very comfortable harvest. Their example may be worth mentioning. Of course, there's a little bit of Old English spelling in there, but it's pretty easy to read. Now, it was controversial, though, in a lot of its content, and there is an issue of this newspaper, but it folded after just one issue. And this was the case with a lot of very early newspapers all over, is that they might publish a few days or a few weeks or even a few months, but they were either overcome by a lack of resources, by criticism from the government or other entities, or they simply just didn't have the advertising to help sustain them. There's a few other newspapers for a while there. Boston had a couple of newspapers that really started off big there, and of course those newspapers were much important later on in the revolutionary times when they helped lead some of the anti-government expressions then. The New England Courant, which was over here in America, not in England, is interesting because it was run by a publisher named James Franklin. And later on, when James was run off the newspaper, he handed it over to his relative, Benjamin Franklin. And yes, that's the Benjamin Franklin we all know, the inventor, the scientist, the printer, and Ben Franklin took over the publishing of the New England Courant. Now, some of the things that got James Franklin in trouble was for writing articles claiming that the colonial government, in other words, this is before the Revolution, was not protecting people that were living in America from pirates. They were They reported an epidemic of smallpox the government wasn't doing much about. They mocked religion in various forms. And so when America had a colonial government, in other words, before America became America, and English governors and other folks were still kind of running our country, to do that sort of thing could get you in big trouble in the newspaper business. So here is probably the single most important person / information / publication in the history of American newspapers. And the man's name, who owned a paper called the New York Weekly Journal in 1733, John Peter Zenger. He founded the paper, and like a lot of other publishers of the time, he criticized the colonial government at the time. The guy's name was William Cosby. What happened was Cosby had gone in, decided he didn't like the Supreme Court justice on the New York Supreme Court, had just thrown him out. There was no real due process. He decided they were doing things and ruling on cases that wasn't to his satisfaction. And so Zenger came out and criticized this governor for overstepping his bounds. Cosby turned around and arrested him for, quote, divers, which means diverse or many, scandalous, virulent, false, and seditious reflections. Seditious is basically a short word saying you have committed treason upon the government. So Zenger hired a Philadelphia lawyer named Andrew Hamilton. Yes, the Andrew Hamilton we are familiar with from our presidential history and from recent plays and things like that. He defended Zenger, and he argued, hey, what was published was factual and truthful. He was not lying when he said that you threw the Supreme Court justices out. He was not lying when he printed that what the reasons why you gave why this was happening. And the jury, kind of to a lot of people's surprise, found Zenger not guilty. And this established that if journalists could report factually and truthfully, then the government and other people couldn't come out and successfully sue them for libel or sedition or any of those other things. So that established what we now call freedom of the press. So this is why America is much harder to prove libel or slander in America, because you have to prove that the information is actually false, that somebody, in some cases, that somebody came after you trying to injure your reputation or defame you. And the jury in America, an American-based jury, said no, what he published was true. He didn't do anything wrong. And this is single-handedly the pivotal point in ensuring that American journalism was distinctly in America. In England, journalists there, and even to this day, to some extent, have to get approval to publish what they publish in most newspapers. That's less true today, but it was true at the time and for decades. And so that's why America's freedom of the press so different. And it's why that the First Amendment, the Constitution, protects, among other things, freedom of the press. It was considered that, along with separation of church, or the right to practice your own religion, the right to give speeches, was considered one of the Founding Fathers' most important rights that we as Americans should have. And speaking of the First Amendment, there it is. I want you to be able to recognize this in the test. I don't want you to memorize it. You don't have to memorize it. You don't have to know it word for word. But if I give you some samples and I'll ask you which one is the First Amendment, you should be able to identify it. So Congress shall make no law respecting an establishment of religion, that's the number one part of it, or prohibiting the free exercise thereof. In other words, you can't tell people they can't establish a religion, and you can't prohibit them from freely exercising their rights to practice that religion. Now, as times have gotten more complicated, the definition of whether something's a religion or not has unfortunately come down to not principles and morals so much as it has to tax write-offs and and other political issues. Second clause of the First Amendment is, Congress shall make no law abridging the freedom of speech or of the press. Okay, that means the same thing. You can't tell us that we don't have freedom of speech. You have to give us freedom of speech. You have to give the press, which at the time was newspapers and people who published pamphlets and broadsides that include radio, TV, and internet now, like it does now, you can't infringe on that. And the last part is the right of the people peaceably to assemble and petition the government for redress of grievances. That simply means the right for us to go out and have a rally and talk about what's bothering us. And you can't shut us down as long as we're being peaceful. Now, of course, you know, things change when peaceable assemblies become riots and people get injured and hurt, then the authorities have the right to come in and do some things. But, you know, I just want to point out that the First Amendment, which is largely based on newspapers in these days, when this was passed in 1791, was all about protecting the freedom to express, for people to express themselves. Now, if they published something that was demonstrably untrue or unfactual, then they could be prosecuted. And the same case is true now. But now we have the bigger problem is, again, is what is factual and what is truth. We can talk about that at some point if you want to. So a few years later, Congress, not to be dissuaded, in 1798 passed what's called the Sedition Act. And in essence, it declared that, this is a quote from it, writing, printing, uttering, or publishing any false, scandalous, and malicious writing or writings against the government of the United States was punishable with fine and imprisonment. So that kind of was an attempt by Congress to fight back against the Zenger case and some other cases that had come along. You could say, well, it doesn't sound much different than what the Zenger case says. You know, if you publish something false, then it's not protected. But insert the word scandalous and malicious, and right away you have who decides what's scandalous. Is it the government, or is it the public, or is it the publisher who represents the public? So this is like putting a foot in the water, shark-infested waters again for freedom of the press. It was leading down a bad road. And then our buddy Thomas Jefferson, who was elected president 2 years later in 1800, allowed the Sedition Act to lapse, and basically said, no, you're not going to be able to, infringe on the freedom of the press that way either, by you declaring it as scandalous. That's not good enough. You have, if things are true, if things are facts are correct, and you have not deliberately tried to harm someone's reputation, then you can't have it both ways. So he just let it lapse, and so of course we basically had free press from then to this day. It doesn't mean that newspaper publishers and reporters and other people haven't gone to jail for exercising their rights to freedom of expression, but it does mean that for the most part they'd be able to at least write it without being edited ahead of time. So that's the end of part one. I hope you enjoyed it. We've got a couple more parts to go, and I'll see you soon.